Welcome to World History. Today we're going to be delving into a world that we're much less familiar with, the world of ancient Persia. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. The Persian Empire was founded by a leader named Cyrus the Great. Persia went from becoming a tiny little state right down here, now next to the Persian Gulf, to, under Cyrus and his son's leadership, one of the largest empires in the ancient world. Persians were known for incorporating conquered peoples into their empire in a very organic way. So, for example, when they conquered people who were very good at building ships, guess what? Now you're building ships for the Persian Navy. When they conquered people who were incredibly good infantry soldiers, they would incorporate them in and say, guess what? Now you're going to be foot soldiers in the Persian army. And by doing this, they both welcomed in new groups of people and gave them a clear role to play in the Persian Empire, and also made their empire stronger. And so, what the Persian Empire, one of the things the Persian Empire is most known for, is its diversity and its incorporation of subject peoples. Obviously, it's also known for the failed Persian War, in which one of Cyrus's heirs, Xerxes, fails to conquer the Greek peninsula. But that should not be our defining moment for Persia, which is a society that keeps showing up again and again throughout world history. So you need to be at least somewhat familiar with it. The Persians gave us a religion called Zoroastrianism, which you don't need to know much about the specific tenets, but what you do need to know is it's one of the first world religions that had a conception of good versus evil. The Greek gods and other sort of ancient religious traditions didn't have a sense of good or evil in a real sense, right? Zeus wasn't good or evil. He just was and he did stuff, as did, Poseidon and Ares and all these other gods. Whereas in Zoroastrianism, they viewed the world as a struggle between the forces of good and evil. So adding a component of morality into religion was a new invention of the Persian Empire, and of course would become a tenet of an important piece of a lot of religions going forward. The diversity of the Persian Empire is one of the most important pieces of it. Subject peoples, and as you can see here, the Persians conquered a lot of different peoples, were organized into more or less self governing little provinces known as satrapies. And for the most part, as long as you paid your taxes and showed up if the Persian Empire needed something, the Persian Empire more or less left these conquered peoples alone. And so many people in the Persian Empire were very happy to live under the Persians. The Persians developed an effective system of government to allow you to ask the central government for things, and they could potentially provide that. They had a very efficient postal and road system connecting the empire together. And famously, they resettled the Jewish peoples who originally had lived in the state of Israel, but were conquered and dispersed by the Babylonians. Cyrus the Great allowed the Jewish people, who are a monotheistic religion, one of the first monotheistic religions in world history, to settle back in the kingdom of Israel. And so the Persian Empire has a place of honor within the Torah and, of course, then within the Bible. I'll give you a second to pause the video and take this in. This is Herodotus, our famous Greek historian that we introduced last time. He describes some pieces of Persian culture, so take a moment. The most important pieces are the adoption of foreign customs and the idea that lying is the worst thing that a Persian could do. And so that was deeply ingrained within Persian society, the value of honesty. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the first Persian empire of Cyrus the Great, was conquered by a Macedonian general named Alexander. Here is our Alexander the Great here. He launched a massive campaign, ostensibly to punish the Persians for invading Greece in the Persian Wars, but honestly more for his own glory. His armies were incredibly effective because they had a modified phalanx, the sort of Greek formation of spearmen, but they had much longer spears, which allowed them to hold enemies at arm's length and defeat much larger enemy forces due to their very effective charges. And so Alexander was able to destroy the Persian Empire without ever losing a battle, conquering all the way to the Indus River, over here on the almost in India. So Alexander conquers the first Persian Empire, and but once Alexander died, his empire collapsed into four different kingdoms, each one controlled by one of his generals. And so Seleucus created the Seleucid dynasty, which ruled Persia very temporarily before collapsing, and then the Persians reinstituted many aspects of their own culture. So, although Alexander helped spread Greek culture across the Eastern Mediterranean, all of his empires were very short lived, or most of his empires were very short lived and collapsed within a few years. The Persians re-emerged first as the Parthian Empire, capturing most of the area they had held previously, and then finally the Sasanian Empire, which is one of the golden ages of Persia. The Sasanians had a very effective tax system, and they had very advanced architecture, building very large cities and temples. They constantly feuded with the Romans. They constantly feuded with the Roman Empire, which we'll be discussing later. But this was really a golden age of Persian culture, both as far as the temples that they built, the art and the trade that the Persian Empire had, and their military technology, including fully armored horses as heavy cavalry that could just mow down enemy infantry by more or less riding over them. So the Persian Empire is an important fixture of the ancient world. And as we move forward, we'll be seeing new versions of the Persian Empire cropping up ever so often. But the final destruction of the Zoroastrian Persians came with the rise of Islam, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Islam is, of course, going to spread through. Islam spread throughout the Middle East, and one of the first conquests of the new caliphate was the Sasanian Empire. And so Islam is going to spread quickly throughout Persia and is going to become the central religion, replacing Zoroastrianism after the conquests of the 600s.